consensus that warming would happen. I teach history of science, and one of the points I always try to make to my students is that many of us have an image of scientific discovery as an event. We have an image of scientific discovery as a eureka moment. But really, scientific discovery is not an event. It's a process. It's a process that unfolds over a period of time. And in this story, we see certain key milestones in that process. And I would say that this is the first key milestone. That is to say, a kind of first part of the consensus, a consensus about a prediction, a consensus about an expectation, that given everything we knew about the climate system, given the evidence of increasing carbon dioxide that Dave Keeling had measured, and given climate models used to test predictions about what the impacts would be, a consensus had emerged that global warming would happen. But the question that had, and also a consensus about its significance, that it was not a small concern. So the National Research Council wrote at the same time, the close linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which his society has evolved suggests that such climatic changes would have profound impacts on human society. And I find this very interesting because in some ways we're still grappling with this problem today. So in 1979, scientists understood that part of the reason why this issue mattered is because we've evolved and developed as a species over a relatively short period of time during which the climatic system of the Earth has been actually exceptionally stable over the last 10,000 years. A very small window of average temperatures have prevailed on Earth for the last 10,000 years. So this linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which our society has evolved was really a crucial part of the insight. And that if the climate started to change in dramatic ways, that we would not necessarily be prepared to deal with it. So the big question, however, the question about which there was not yet a consensus, was when. How soon would these changes be expected to occur? Most scientists thought that these changes would probably not become detectable until the 21st century. So the reports from that period talk about the year 2000, 2010, 2030, 2050. So the surprising result, the result that really took the scientific community aback, was when detectable changes occurred. I'm standing too far away from my computer here. Okay, come on, baby. There we go. Only 6 years later. 6 years later, NASA climate modeler Jim Hansen and his team published a series of peer-reviewed articles in which they concluded that the climate signal from human effects, from human forcings, had in fact been detected. And in the summer of 1988, as major heat waves and droughts struck the Midwest of the United States and Canada, Hansen testified in Congress that he was now 99% certain that climate change had in fact become detectable. So we see in this story not that scientists were alarmists, but actually the opposite. That scientists were actually rather conservative in their expectations, and that climate change has unfolded rather more rapidly than most scientists thought would occur. But it was this emerging and rather disturbing consensus that climate change had in fact become detectable a good 20, 30, 40, 50 years before most scientists thought would happen, that had led in part to the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. But it also led to something else. It led to the emergence of a politically motivated campaign to challenge the scientific consensus and to cast doubt upon the scientific evidence. The campaign focused on the claim that the science was unsettled, that there was no consensus among experts, and therefore it would be premature to act, and maybe even a little bit foolish or silly. As a historian, I'm interested in the origins of things. I'm interested in where things come from and how they develop and change over time. So part of the task that Eric Conway and I set for ourselves was to understand where these claims had come from. And it turns out that the origins of this claim can be traced back to a shockingly small group of people. In fact, to 3 men and 1 think tank. Now today, doubt is promoted about climate science in many quarters in the United States, Canada, Australia, Germany, and elsewhere. But one of the most important sources of claims that the science is not settled, going back to 1988, going back to this crucial period when the scientific consensus first began to emerge, is a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the George C. Marshall Institute. For 2 decades, the Marshall Institute has denied the reality of global warming, or insisted that if there is warming, it's simply caused by natural variability. So where did the Marshall Institute come from? And why do they promote doubt? about climate science? Well, the Marshall Institute was founded by three men. They were all physicists. They were all physicists who had built their careers and come to positions of prominence, influence, and power during the Cold War, working on Cold War weapons and rocketry programs. On the left, Robert Jastrow, an astrophysicist who was the head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, part of NASA. On the right, William Nierenberg, a nuclear physicist who had worked on the atomic bomb as part of the Manhattan Project, and subsequently became director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where he supervised and sponsored numerous projects funded by the U.S. Navy related to Cold War weapons programs, particularly the accurate launching and delivery of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And in the center, Frederick Seitz, a solid-state physicist who had worked on the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and many other issues for the U.S. military during the Cold War, become a science advisor to NATO, and had risen to prominence as the president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and then as the president of the Rockefeller University for Biomedical Research. These men had known each other for many years. They had served on many advisory panels. They had served on many committees that gave advice to Congress, the President of the United States, to the U.S. military. And in the 1980s, they were asked by the Reagan administration to serve on a committee giving advice about Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, or what most of us know of as Star Wars, the idea of building a defensive shield against incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. In 1984, Jastrow, Seitz, and Nierenberg created the Marshall Institute to defend SDI against the scientist boycott, and to promote the continuing importance of science and technology in national defense, in part by insisting on the reality of Soviet strength and the reality of U.S. weakness. They published a number of articles, opinion pieces, wrote letters to editors, insisting that the United States was falling behind the Soviet Union, and that if we didn't build a missile defense shield and many other high-technology weapon systems, that we would fall behind in the arms race, and that the Soviet Union could invade Europe or the Middle East with impunity. I don't have time to give you many examples, but this is my favorite one, published in 1987, America Has 5 Years Left. Now, at the same time, Frederick Seitz, all three of these men were quite senior at this point, and Frederick Seitz had retired from the Rockefeller University. In his retirement, he took on one additional job, and that was working as a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation. Now, many of you know that when the scientific evidence began to mount of the harms of tobacco, the tobacco industry began to challenge that evidence. And through the work of historians such as Robert Proctor and Alan Brandt, David Michaels, and others, we know that the principal strategy that the tobacco industry used to defend its product against the scientific evidence was doubt-mongering. To say that we didn't really know for sure, that the science was unsettled, that there are many causes of cancer, and you can never prove that any one particular person's lung cancer is caused by smoking, even if they smoked 3 packs a day for 30 years. And to recruit scientific experts who would testify to this effect in court. And therefore, it would be premature to control tobacco use, and wrong to hold the tobacco industry responsible for any damages relating to health-related effects of smoking. Well, this was a highly effective strategy. The tobacco industry boasted for many years that using this strategy, they had been able to stave off government regulation of tobacco. Up until 1979, they had won all of their court cases against tobacco litigants. And in 1989, these two stories merged. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union, that Jastrow, Nierenberg, and Seitz thought was such a profound threat, disintegrated before our very eyes, and very rapidly indeed. So with the Cold War over, you might have thought that these men would have been happy. You might have thought that they were pleased that their life's work had achieved the very goal that they had wanted, which was American dominance and Soviet collapse. But they weren't happy. Rather, they were like old generals who can't stop fighting the last war. They began to look for a new enemy. And I find it very significant that the very first paper they published challenging the scientific evidence of global warming was released in 1989. The Cold Warriors found a new enemy, a new set of reds under the bed. And that new enemy was what they called environmental extremists, what they considered to be the exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing agenda. And using the experience that Frederick Seitz had had working with the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation, they applied the tobacco strategy to insist that the science was unsettled. Doubt is our product, ran the infamous memo written by one tobacco industry executive in 1969, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. So here we see doubt being merchandised, doubt being sold as a product. But one of the things the tobacco industry realized early on was that if tobacco industry executives stood up in public and said, well, you know, we're not really sure that tobacco causes cancer, most of us would not be so gullible as to find that claim credible. And in particular, journalists would not find that claim credible. But if they could find scientists to make this claim, particularly prominent scientists, if they could get a president of the National Academy of Sciences to say it, well, that was quite a different matter. So a crucial part of the tobacco strategy was the recruitment of scientists who could speak to the question of doubt. They didn't have to be oncologists, they didn't have to be epidemiologists, because journalists never asked what their actual credentials were. It was enough for them simply to say, we're scientists. It reminds me of that scene in the movie Ghostbusters. How many people have seen the film Ghostbusters? Yeah, and there's that great scene where Bill Murray charges in and says to Sigourney Weaver, back off, man, we're scientists. So it's a bit like that. So these scientists supplied it. But not just about the harms of tobacco. Throughout the 1980s into the 1990s and right up to the present day, this small group of scientists, and now a new set of younger ones who have taken their place, supplied doubt about the threat of nuclear winter, the reality of acid rain, the severity of the ozone hole, the human causes of global warming, and most troubling of all, in a recent kind of revisionist attack, trying to reopen the debate about the safety and hazards of the pesticide DDT. So in our book, we have chapters dealing with each of these issues, and we show that in every single case, time again and again and again, over the course of 3, 4, 5 decades, the same playbook was used every time. And it was always the tobacco strategy. It was always to say, you know, we don't really know, the jury's still out, I'm an agnostic, let's wait and see. The physicists in our story cast doubt on every one of these issues, and in every single case insisted that the science was too uncertainty to warrant government action. Now, to learn how they did it, you'll have to read the book. Can't give away all my secrets. What I'd like to focus on for the remainder of the evening is why. Why they did it. Because this was, for us, in a way, the most perplexing part of the story. Why would distinguished scientists attack the work of their own colleagues? In some cases, people that they had actually hired in their own institutions. So why would they betray the very science to which they'd been dedicated? And these were all pretty wealthy men. We never found any evidence in the archives that they had done this primarily for money. So we were really interested in what would motivate people to do something like this. And also because I believe the motivation is really crucial, because if you want to remedy a problem, you have to understand its causes. Just like we need to know that greenhouse gases cause global warming if we're going to stop global warming, we need to know what motivates doubt-mongering if we're going to adequately respond to it. And also because we wanted to answer the question, why did this strategy work so well? Why did it gain so much traction, especially on the conservative or right-wing side of the U.S. and Canadian political spectrum? And why the issue is now so polarized when most climate scientists would say that these are simply matters of fact? So the short answer is ideology. And in particular, the version of neoliberalism that George Soros has called free market fundamentalism. That is to say, the faith in free markets to solve all problems, including social and environmental ones. So to understand this, we need to talk a little bit about modern neoliberalism. Modern neoliberalism covers a fairly wide range of views, but the essential core of it is the belief in the power of the marketplace and the belief in the importance of deregulation of markets in order to release the so-called magic of the marketplace. It came to prominence in the early 1980s, promoted particularly in the United States by Ronald Reagan, and in the United Kingdom by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But it wasn't just conservatives, Republicans, Tories, and what you guys call liberals, and we call conservatives. It's always a little confusing. In America, the term neoliberal really confuses people. In Australia and Europe and Canada, neoliberalism is a term that makes more sense, given what liberals are in places like Canada. But it wasn't just conservative.